Have you ever seen a child who doesn't speak, doesn't cry, doesn't even smile, just quietly walks over and climbs into someone's lap? Like that's the only safe place left in the world? Today's story doesn't begin with a warm invitation. It begins with something far more powerful. A small act that didn't ask for permission, only to be left undisturbed. If you believe that sometimes it's a child who gives the first hug, not because they're brave, but because they're tired enough to trust. Like this video, and stay with us till the end, because today, a silent seat beside someone will teach a father how to step back, without stepping away. Sunday brunch at Ellsworth and Pine was always a quiet sort of chaos. Linen napkins folded just so, the faint clinking of glasses and cutlery, the low hum of families murmuring over eggs Benedict and silver-dollar pancakes. It was the kind of place that managed to stay elegant despite the swarm of strollers and toddler-sized sneakers under the tables. Walter Reeves, impeccably dressed in a navy cashmere blazer and a wristwatch that never strayed a second off schedule, was seated at a corner table near the window. His 7-year-old son Owen sat across from him, or rather, perched unsteadily on the edge of his seat. The boy's sneakers barely touched the rung of the chair, his fingers clenched and unclenched in patterns known only to him. He hadn't said a word. He never did. Walter checked the time. 11:42 a.m. Pancakes were due to arrive by 11:45. Owen's comfort relied on predictability. Every part of their day was mapped. Meals, transitions, even quiet time, all penciled into a tightly managed schedule that Walter updated weekly. He watched his son from behind a veil of control, measuring the boy's stillness like an investor reading a volatile market. Any moment, Owen could melt down. Or maybe today would be the miracle. 2 tables away, Hannah Lee moved quickly but gently. She placed a plate of waffles in front of a laughing child, offered his mother a warm smile, and turned. That was when she saw him. Owen had risen from his seat. Silent. Small. Hannah paused mid-step, tray still in her hand, brow barely furrowing. The boy wasn't running. Wasn't smiling. Just walking forward, his arms slightly stiff at his sides, eyes locked on hers with an intensity that didn't ask questions, didn't leave room for answers. Walter's body tensed, rising halfway out of his chair. His hand gripped the edge of the table. "Owen," he called softly, but the boy didn't respond. Hannah stayed still. And then, without a word, Owen climbed into her lap. The tray in her hand wobbled, but she didn't drop it. She set it down carefully on a side table and sank slowly into the nearest chair, her movements instinctive, like settling into water rather than reacting to it. The boy curled into her, his head resting awkwardly on her shoulder, one small fist clutching the hem of her apron. His body molded to hers with the ease of someone returning to a place they'd once known, even if only in a dream. She didn't ask his name. Didn't look around for permission. Hannah just held him. Not tightly. Not like a rescue. But like a soft place to fall. For a moment, there was a hush. A strange kind of reverence settled in the dining room, as if everyone understood that something sacred had just been allowed to happen. Walter remained frozen at his table. His son, the boy who hadn't let anyone touch him since his wife passed, was now folded into the arms of a stranger. A waitress. He felt a dozen eyes on him. Judging. Wondering. But Hannah never looked his way. She didn't shift the boy's weight or try to explain. She simply adjusted her shoulders slightly, allowing Owen's cheek to find a more comfortable spot against her collarbone. Her hand stayed open on her lap, not gripping, not guiding. Just there. Walter sat down again, slowly. His breath came shallow. He didn't know this woman. Didn't even know her name. But his son had gone to her as if drawn by memory, or instinct, or something that had nothing to do with logic. And in that moment, all of Walter's calendars, all his structured routines and carefully chosen therapeutic tools, none of it mattered. His son had made a choice. And Hannah had simply let it be. Hannah's breath caught, just for a moment. She wasn't unfamiliar with the weight of a child. Her arms had once known the soft heft of newborns, the way their bodies curved naturally into a caregiver's frame. But that was another life, back when she wore hospital scrubs instead of a server's apron, back when she still believed that holding someone meant you could keep them safe. Now, the small boy in her lap didn't feel like a job or an emergency. He felt like a decision. One that hadn't been hers to make, and yet was now entirely hers to carry. She froze, not from fear, but from something deeper, reverence, maybe. Her hands hovered awkwardly in the air, unsure of their place. For a single heartbeat, she considered standing, calling over the father, explaining. But the boy didn't flinch. Didn't shift. His breathing was uneven but soft, the way small animals settle once they've found somewhere warm. His fist still clutched the edge of her apron, knuckles pale. His cheek pressed against her collarbone. She could feel his body trembling, not violently, just a gentle, unsettled rhythm, like a wind chime swaying before a storm. So she didn't ask his name. She didn't ask him to move. She simply lowered one hand to the center of his back, open and flat, and held it there. Not pushing, not guiding, just present. Her palm rose and fell with his breath, adjusting to his timing. It felt like holding a shirt fresh from the wash, fragile, vulnerable, warm. She lowered herself slowly into the nearest chair, careful not to jostle him, the motion fluid and precise like muscle memory she hadn't used in years. The din of the restaurant continued, forks clinking, children squealing, someone laughing too loudly in the corner booth, but in their little bubble, there was stillness. Hannah sat straight-backed, eyes forward. She didn't rock him or stroke his hair. She didn't try to soothe or distract. She just stayed, letting him stay. There was no instruction manual for this moment. Nothing from her training had ever addressed what to do when a stranger's child climbs into your lap and wraps himself around your silence. But maybe it wasn't about training. Maybe it was about not interrupting something that had finally found its shape. A few minutes passed. Or maybe it was longer, time warped in moments like these, where every second felt delicate and whole. The boy's breathing began to slow. His body, curled tightly at first, had softened. His fingers still gripped her apron, but more loosely now, like he was beginning to believe it wouldn't be taken from him. Hannah kept her eyes ahead, not daring to look around the room. She didn't want to see the judgment, or worse, the sympathy. She didn't want someone to tell her she was doing the right thing, or that she was brave, or that it was sweet. She wasn't trying to be anything. She was just there. And the boy? He hadn't asked to be held. He had asked in his own way, not to be alone. It was a difference she understood more than she cared to admit. Some people move toward others to be saved. Others move toward them just to stop sinking. Hannah had done both in her lifetime, with friends, with lovers, with ghosts. But never had she felt such clarity in staying still. The weight of the boy, the shape of his presence, the quiet of his trust, it all folded into her like an answer to a question she'd stopped asking. And for the first time in months, maybe years, Hannah didn't feel like she was pretending to be okay. She didn't feel like she was borrowing someone else's strength or holding herself together with duct tape and polite smiles. She just existed, as a lap, as a shoulder, as a space. And it was enough. Walter Reeves rose from his seat with a speed that betrayed the careful discipline he lived by. His chair scraped slightly against the polished wood floor, the motion drawing a glance or two from nearby tables. His eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding just a few feet away, his son Owen, curled into the lap of a waitress like she'd been there all along waiting. His instinct was to move, to retrieve, to restore order. But his legs locked, halfway between reaction and restraint. Something about the boy's stillness, about the quiet curve of his back, the gentle drape of his limbs, the way his small body had melted into hers, made Walter stop. He didn't understand it. Couldn't begin to. Owen didn't climb into laps. He hadn't, not once, since Margaret died. Even Walter himself hadn't been permitted that intimacy, not during night terrors, not during meltdowns, not in the darkest corners of Owen's grief. The boy had withdrawn into a silent world made of rituals and repetitions. A world Walter tried daily to decode with charts, timers, and therapeutic worksheets. But nothing, not even the most structured sensory tools, had ever earned what this woman had in a matter of seconds: proximity. A murmur passed through the room, barely audible but piercing to Walter's hyper-aware ears. "That's his father, isn't it?" a woman said softly from the next table. Her voice wasn't cruel, just curious. Walter didn't turn toward her. He didn't acknowledge it. He remained frozen, a billionaire, a builder of towers, a man who had sat across from governors and global financiers, now rendered immobile by a child and a stranger with an apron and a soft, steady spine. He studied the woman. She hadn't looked up once. She wasn't scanning the room for approval or apology. She wasn't explaining herself, or laughing nervously, or offering a single word to account for the strange intimacy now seated at her table. Instead, she bowed her head ever so slightly, as if to shield the boy's ear from the light, or perhaps to meet the curve of his breath. Her body shifted not in large gestures, but in tiny, patient accommodations. The way her shoulder tilted, just enough for Owen's cheek to settle deeper into the crook of her neck. The way her torso leaned slightly forward, not too far, not hovering, just enough to make a quiet cradle. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to move. A slow, rhythmic sway. Not a rock, not a bounce. More like the body's unconscious response to another life breathing against it. It was the motion of a woman who wasn't fixing anything. Wasn't performing care. Wasn't soothing to elicit a result. She was simply matching the boy's breath. Letting her own body say, "You can rest here." Walter's throat tightened. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't since the funeral. Not because people were watching, though he knew they were, but because he didn't know what to do. There had always been a plan. Always a way to regain control. But this was beyond his reach. And somehow the absence of action became its own kind of mirror, one that forced him to see the space between him and his son in stark, cruel clarity. There had been no permission asked. No transition cue. No timer. No gentle phrasing of "would you like to sit with someone new?" The boy had simply moved, instinctively, trustingly, toward a presence that didn't require translation. And Walter had nothing in his hands to offer in return. For a man who made a living orchestrating cities, who could arrange the lighting of entire downtown skylines with a few well-placed calls, it was humbling to realize that his son's first act of peace in years had happened entirely outside his design. He glanced back at the woman. Still silent. Still steady. She looked ordinary, but not unremarkable. There was something in the set of her jaw, the deliberate lack of performance, the way she wore the moment like a well-worn coat, neither flaunting it nor resisting its weight. Walter let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He didn't step forward. He didn't interrupt. And somehow, that felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. The weight of a child in sleep is a different thing entirely. It settles. It trusts. It forgets the world in a way that adults envy but rarely allow themselves to remember. Owen, now curled into the crook of Hannah's body, had drifted off without warning. His breathing, once shallow and unsure, had deepened into the gentle rhythm of sleep, the kind that only comes when the body, and maybe even the soul, believes it's finally safe. His head lay nestled into the space between her collarbone and shoulder. One hand remained on the edge of her apron, fingers no longer clutched but resting, like he no longer needed to hold on so tightly. His legs, once tucked in defensively, had softened their bend. The tension in his jaw had melted away. And Hannah didn't move. Not for the first 5 minutes. Not for the next 10. Not even when her right leg began to tingle slightly from the weight. She just sat there, spine straight but relaxed, gaze unfocused on some spot across the restaurant, beyond the clatter of dishes and the flow of brunch traffic. Time didn't feel linear. It felt suspended, like this pocket of stillness had carved itself out from the rest of the day. The noise around her didn't reach her in the same way anymore. Customers came and went. Coffee cups clinked. Laughter bubbled up in fits and starts. But in her corner of the room, there was only the soft rise and fall of a boy's chest and the quiet reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is absolutely nothing. To anyone watching, it may have seemed unremarkable, a child asleep in a woman's arms. But for Hannah, it felt holy. And she knew instinctively that if she moved too soon, the spell would break. She didn't need to know the boy's diagnosis to understand this moment. Trauma didn't always announce itself with a scream. Sometimes, it showed up quietly, asking only to be held until it passed. And so she held. Around the 15-minute mark, she sensed the shift in air before she saw him. The manager, Mr. Dillard, was approaching, clipboard in hand, brow already furrowed in a polite version of frustration. He was a man of policies and pacing charts, a former hotel maitre d', who believed in flow above all things. He didn't like disruption. He especially didn't like delays. He stopped a few feet away, cleared his throat gently, and leaned in just enough to speak over the hum of the restaurant. "Hannah," he said, his tone low but pointed, "are you?" "If Mr. Reeves needs me to leave," she interrupted, voice soft but steady, "I will." She didn't look up. She didn't raise her voice. "But I'll go after he wakes up. Not before." There was no edge to her words. No defiance. Just fact. The manager glanced at the boy, then at Walter, who still sat frozen nearby, and finally back at Hannah. He didn't speak. Didn't nod. He just hesitated for one long breath and then stepped away without another word. Hannah returned her gaze to that same distant spot. She adjusted nothing. She simply remained still, letting the moment unfold on its own terms. There was a strange kind of dignity in it, in not rushing peace. She didn't know how long the boy would sleep, or what he would do when he woke. But none of that mattered. What mattered was this: he had chosen her. In a room full of people, with his father just feet away, he had climbed into her lap and trusted her not to move. So she wouldn't. Not until he did. Walter hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes, and for a man whose life revolved around motion, flights, meetings, deals, it was an unfamiliar and uncomfortable sensation. His back ached from sitting so stiffly. His hands, once clenched around the rim of the table, now rested awkwardly in his lap, fingers twitching with uncertainty. Owen hadn't stirred. The boy remained curled into the lap of the woman Walter still hadn't spoken to. She hadn't shifted either. Not in any significant way. Just small adjustments, a tilt of the head, a realignment of her shoulder, measured, careful, quiet. And still, Walter hesitated. Then finally, something pushed him to stand. He crossed the space slowly, his movements deliberate. Not wanting to startle. Not wanting to overstep. He wasn't used to feeling unsure in his own steps. But this wasn't a boardroom. There was no agenda, no line item for retrieve son from stranger's arms. Only instinct, and even that felt faulty now. He stopped a foot away. Cleared his throat. His voice came out softer than he expected, almost apologetic. "I can take him back," he said quietly. "To our table." It wasn't a command. It was an offer. Or maybe a question. He wasn't sure anymore. The woman, Hannah, didn't look up immediately. Her gaze remained on the middle distance, on the nothingness she'd been watching since the boy fell asleep. But when she did turn to him, there was no fear. No hesitation. Just a quiet strength that startled him. Her voice was even. Gentle. But what she said struck him in a place he'd forgotten he had. "He chose where to sit," she said. "If you're worried, you can sit beside us. But don't take him away while he's finally calm." It wasn't rude. It wasn't defensive. It was something worse. It was true. Walter blinked. He opened his mouth. Closed it again. His breath hitched in his throat as if he were trying to formulate a rebuttal, but the words wouldn't form. Because what could he say? That he was the parent? That he knew better? That this, whatever this was inappropriate? That Owen had never been this still, this peaceful, since the night his world fell apart. He looked down at his son. Owen's face was nestled into the woman's chest, features slack with sleep. His fingers still rested on her apron, not clinging now, but simply resting, like he no longer feared the need to hold on. Walter remembered when that used to be him. When Owen would climb into his lap after story time, or tuck his head beneath Walter's chin when thunder rolled across the sky. That was before Margaret passed. Before everything hardened. Before the boy began to drift farther and farther into silence. Walter inhaled deeply. Then slowly, almost awkwardly, he lowered himself into the empty chair beside her. The one closest to his son, but not touching. He didn't reach for Owen. Didn't adjust his posture. Just sat. He let the silence hold. He let the moment belong to someone else. The restaurant noise faded behind the sound of his own heartbeat. His hands rested on his knees, unsure. His eyes stayed fixed on the boy's face, taking in every detail, the way his lashes trembled slightly, the curve of his cheek against soft cotton, the way his body fit so naturally against this woman he didn't know. And in that moment, Walter wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a father in charge. He was simply a man sitting beside his son, not to fix, not to retrieve, but to be near. He didn't know how long he'd sit there. Didn't know what would happen when the boy woke up. But for now, he chose to be present. Not because he knew what to do, but because, for once, doing nothing might be the only thing that mattered. It had been 7 days. Not a word exchanged. No follow-up call. No formal thank you. No awkward return to explain what had happened. Just silence. Until Sunday came again. At precisely 11:38 a.m., the front bell above the restaurant door gave its usual muted chime. Hannah, wiping down a two-top near the windows, didn't look up right away. She was focused on a stubborn water ring that had etched itself into the mahogany surface, swirling her cloth in slow, deliberate circles. When she did glance toward the entrance, she saw them. Walter Reeves. And his son. They weren't dressed like last time. Walter had exchanged his crisp blazer for a soft, olive sweater. Owen wore the same shoes, the same corduroy pants, but no hat this time. His hair had grown a little longer around the ears. They hadn't reserved a table. They didn't wait to be seated. Walter scanned the room, caught Hannah's eye, and gave the briefest nod, not requesting attention, not signaling ownership. Just acknowledgement. Then he stayed by the door. And Owen walked forward on his own. There was no hesitation in his steps. No glances backward. He didn't speak. Didn't even look at the tables or customers he passed. He simply walked, small hands hanging by his sides, gaze forward, as if drawn by something invisible. Hannah paused her wiping. The cloth in her hand slowed, then stilled completely. Owen reached her side and stopped. He didn't climb up this time. Instead, he sat down on the empty chair beside her, a little off-center, legs swinging, not quite touching the floor. He leaned gently, until his shoulder brushed hers. Not forceful. Just there. Like someone testing the edge of a familiar space. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. And she didn't speak. She just shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, to her left. A quiet tilt of her body, enough for her shoulder to press back. A silent invitation, if you need to climb again, I'm still here. Owen didn't move further. He just stayed. Breathing evenly. Hands in his lap. Sitting beside her like it had always been his place. Hannah's breath caught in her chest, not sharply, not painfully, but like something fragile had been handed back to her. A second offering. Not as dramatic as the first. Not soaked in urgency. But steadier. More deliberate. She returned to her cloth, resuming her slow circles on the table's surface. Owen remained next to her, unmoving, quiet. Behind them, Walter didn't approach. He simply stood by the door, watching, Not controlling, not timing, not managing the moment. Just witnessing. And somehow, that made all the difference. There was something sacred about returns. Not the kind forced by obligation or formality, but the kind that says, I felt safe here once. Can I feel safe again? Owen's small shoulder pressed against hers, and she didn't lean away. She didn't praise him. Didn't analyze the moment or celebrate the progress. She knew better than to make something delicate feel observed. She just kept wiping slowly. Letting him be. Letting herself be. And in the quiet between them, a kind of language formed, one without names or diagnoses or plans. A language made of shared stillness. Of proximity without pressure. Of permission granted not with words, but with presence. The room was quiet, though not in the way most rooms fall silent. This quiet had weight. Intention. It wrapped around each person like a warm blanket, heavy, still, and profoundly gentle. It was the first session of Pick Your Seat. An experimental program, yes, but not one born from a classroom or a clinic. It had no textbook. No behavior charts. Just one founding idea. Every child deserves to feel safe where they sit. Walter had funded the space. Hannah had helped design it. There were no rows of desks. No rigid circle time rugs. Instead, the room was filled with options. Big pillows in every shade of calm, armchairs low to the ground, benches with cushions, open floor mats, small cots tucked beneath windowsills. And chairs, of course. But none matching. None demanding. No one told the children where to go. They were simply invited to choose. Some crawled beneath tables. Some sprawled across the floor. One girl curled into a corner with a blanket shaped like a fox. Another boy sat on the floor with his head resting against the back of a rocking chair, never rocking it. There were a few adults present, volunteers mostly. No one issued commands. No one cheered when a child made a good choice. There was no such thing here. And in the center of it all, Hannah sat cross-legged on a thick floor cushion, hands resting in her lap, eyes soft. Beside her sat a chair, not for her, but left open. Waiting. Walter stood off to the side, near the coffee station. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He simply observed, his face unreadable except for a slight crease in his brow, not worry but attention. And then Owen entered. He didn't cling to the doorway like before. Didn't scan the room nervously. He just walked in, small backpack bouncing against his spine, shoes making soft contact with the rubber tiles. He looked around once. Then spotted her. And walked straight toward the open chair. He stopped in front of it, glancing at Hannah. Not speaking. Not rushing. Just waiting. Their eyes met. And for a second, the room fell into a stiller stillness. He didn't climb into her lap. He didn't press his face into her shoulder. Instead, he looked at her, as if asking, is it still okay? Is this still mine? And Hannah, without a word, gave the smallest nod. Owen sat. Not on her. Beside her. Close enough to touch, but not touching. And it was perfect. Walter blinked hard. Swallowed. The space his son had taken wasn't about comfort anymore. It wasn't about fear. It was about agency. He had chosen where to go. Who to sit with. And when. No one had lifted him. No one had prompted him. No one had explained his behavior. He simply belonged. Later, when a reporter asked Walter why a billionaire would fund something with so little structure and so few results to quantify, he gave an answer that surprised even him. Because for the first time, he'd said, my son didn't need permission to be at peace. And Hannah? She just kept sitting. Not reaching. Not leading. Just ready. In case the seat beside her ever needed to be a lap again. As we grow older, many of us become caretakers in some form, of children, of spouses, of aging parents, even of memories that no longer speak but still linger. We learn how to manage, how to prepare, how to shield those we love from discomfort or confusion. And yet, sometimes the most powerful form of care isn't doing more, it's knowing when to step back. This story reminded us that peace cannot always be scheduled, explained, or earned. Sometimes, it arrives quietly. In the form of a child who chooses stillness beside someone who simply lets him be. For older adults, especially those who have raised children or lost someone they once held close, this may strike a familiar chord. You remember the times when your touch was what calmed a storm, or when your silence spoke louder than words. You've likely known the pain of wanting to fix something that can't be fixed. And maybe like Walter you've had to learn, sometimes the hard way, that love is not always about doing. It's about presence. About letting someone else choose you, and being still enough to receive it. In a world obsessed with control and outcomes, the idea of creating space, rather than filling it, feels countercultural. But maybe that's where healing begins. Not in telling someone what they need, but in letting them come to it on their own, while you sit close enough to be there, just in case. The child in this story didn't ask for advice. He didn't ask for help. He asked for a place to rest. And the woman, burdened by her own quiet grief, gave it without condition. That's a lesson we can all carry, that compassion doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness, patience, and the willingness to let someone be exactly where they are. As we age, we are gifted with the wisdom of watching the world slow down. We see that love isn't always loud, and healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes the most sacred thing we can offer is a chair left open, a nod of permission, the space beside us, without question. Because the truth is, we all remember that one moment when someone didn't push us away. And we never forget it. If you've ever found yourself walking toward someone, not to say anything, but simply to be near, then maybe you understand. Sometimes, the kindest thing in the world is being allowed to curl up in someone's lap, without having to explain why. Like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And tell us, when was the last time you sat in someone's arms, and no one asked why?